This is our February 14th Stop Trump update, and it is entitled Trump and South Carolina Primary 2016, No Ballots. Now, let's review quickly where we've been. We had the Iowa caucus where there was some controversy. Then we had unfortunately, we've now pretty much determined that unfortunately the Trump campaign was not doing anything to watch the vote. They apparently did not have the staff, and the staff they had was focused on getting out the vote. We did have the open letter to DonaldTrump.com up for months, and were not able to break through to anyone to take it seriously that they needed to watch the vote, because besides the Ted Cruz shenanigans saying that Carson was dropping out when he wasn't, you also had, we know from the witnesses we did have, that in a number of places that we were there, the guys leading the caucus tried to take the ballots in the back room to count, which is the first ever that people had seen. And they didn't always succeed in that, but they did try. And in one of them, we had a well-seasoned observer, and she and her friend just followed him back, and everybody else did. But the second thing is they did not have tight procedures for the caucus, and that they should be showing people an empty ballot box, preferably a clear one, but at least empty. And then everyone should vote on their little piece of paper, which were often the size of Post-it notes, and go up and one at a time drop their ballot into the box. And there should be observers watching that they only drop one ballot, and then you count them in front of everybody. That's the way they did it in Dubuque County, Iowa in 1996 when I was there. That's the way they did it at Edward True's caucus in Appanoose County in 2012. That's the way it should have been done. No one apparently was at most of these caucuses watching whether this was done. Now, the big danger, of course, is in Polk and in the counties around Des Moines, where the Republican Party state operatives run it. And there's the big danger, because that's where 80% of the precincts are. Excuse me, not 80%, 40% of the precincts. And that is where Marco Rubio got such an incredibly big vote as opposed to the rest of the state. Same happened to Romney, same happened to Dole. So that's suspicious there. Then we move into New Hampshire. Now, in New Hampshire, you have a situation where Trump was so far ahead in all the polls leading up to that for months, and he was getting, in some cases, 1,000 times the people to show up for his rallies, that I guess and also there may have been, we have good reason to believe that there may have been some people, at least somewhat close to the Trump campaign, although maybe not part of it, who were threatening, in a good way, threatening the New Hampshire vote counters and Secretary of State that they better not cheat Trump in New Hampshire. They were watching, and of course 80% of the vote in New Hampshire was computer counted, only 20% hand counted, but there's something that when you compare the hand count against the computer counts. So Trump wins in New Hampshire according to the published count. Now, this will cause, I know from past experience, that this will cause people to psychologically feel, well, okay, everything's okay. And this is a gigantic mistake. We're fighting very smart people here who have erected the three major companies now that count 96% of the American vote. And we're going to go into that in this particular update, because unfortunately we can't do a 2 or 3 minute update, because the charges we're making here, the realities we're describing, are so unbelievable that we got to go some of a way to document it, so that, because even people that are very smart on all other issues will tend to dismiss this without realizing what's happening, and why the crooks in any society would want to go to the vote count, because then if that can nullify everything else if it's believable. And that's the key, that it be believable. So the main thing that the people running your daily big city newspaper or running CNN or running the vote count have to do is to keep you fooled so that they can deceive you next month and next month and next year. So when the spotlight's on them and you have a situation like Trump getting 1,000 times the people of the other candidates, and winning in so many polls, and there's a lot more independent polls now, not just the big media polls, and I assume Trump is doing his own polls. So they may have to back off here a little bit to keep their credibility, to keep their easily rigged computer election systems in, which is what we want to get thrown out everywhere and return it to a hand count of the neighborhood people. So don't let your guard down just because they let Trump win New Hampshire. And I mean when the 80% of the votes are counted secretly in secretly easily rigged computer programs, they let him win. They could have had another result, but they might have felt that it would be unbelievable and they would be in danger of getting exposed for good. So now we're going to New Hampshire. And we have a new tab up on the openlettertodonaldtrump.com website called South Carolina No Ballots. And it's the last tab on the menu. Click on that, and that's pretty much the text that's serving the basis for this this video, this update. So here we go to South Carolina. There are no ballots, okay? It's the most insult to intelligence system you can imagine. You go and touch a touch screen, and then that bleep of energy is supposedly counted somewhere. There's no chance for a recount because there's no ballots. There's no chance to count the ballots on the spot. And giving a receipt, some people make a big deal. Well, you should at least get a receipt for your ballot. That does you no good. One, you know how you voted. Two, what they show on your receipt can be different than what the computer recorded. This is anybody that knows anything about computers, even a computer dummy like me knows that. So what you get printed out, it could be recording something else inside the machine. And you don't need to know how you voted. You need to know how the 10,000 people in your city and the 10 million people in your state and the 100 million people in your country voted. And that can only be done when you trust the eyewitness reports of the 200,000 other groups of people at the 200,000 other neighborhood precincts. Get the big companies and the Secretary of State and everybody out of it except to authorize those hand counts by the neighbors with all the neighbors from other factions watching, and that's how you do it. So in South Carolina, though, Trump is winning by so much in the polls, and some of the polls coming out after the debate that was held on Saturday the 13th, because the South Carolina primary is on February 20th. The debate was on Saturday night the 13th, showed Trump with over 50%. So again, he said a few things in that debate I'm not on board with, but my point is, we're just looking for a fair count, and we're trying, under the auspices of Watch the Vote and the open letter to DonaldTrump.com. So look at where is all the evidence showing that who's going to win. It's all with Trump. But in South Carolina, if they say, oh, here comes, he attacked George Bush because of 9/11 happening when Bush was president, and he suggested that they didn't keep us safe, and that's running against him because South Carolina is such a military state and all this stuff, and they start that kind of propaganda, then they could say it's very close at the end when it really isn't. Or they could say that Trump even loses because there's no ballots. I mean, everybody should be up in arms on this. And we ask all the candidates, especially Trump and Sanders, but everybody to object to this stupid system. Then we go to Super Tuesday, and even if Trump wins South Carolina, if they got all these states and they have, by the secret computer counts, there are paper ballots in most of those states, but they're whisked away. You can't see them on Election Day, and they say, oh, Trump won this many delegates and Rubio this many and Bush this. Nobody knows if this is true or not when we get to Super Tuesday. What they may have to back off to, because they can't seem to get anybody clearly to seem that they're going to beat Trump believably, they may have to back off to a brokered convention, but this can easily be done because all the counts on Super Tuesday are not really able to be checked by the public. Even when there's ballots, they're whisked away and nobody's allowed to check them. So you see the problem. South Carolina, no ballots. Super Tuesday, no ability to check the ballots on Election Day or for 21 days after, at which point I repeat from other videos, there's plenty of time to switch the ballots. Then we get to the general election, and the establishment is already throwing out one way that they can skew that, and that's by having this horrible anti-American communist billionaire Bloomberg get into the race, who wants to take away everybody's guns. Bloomberg can run, and then they can say anything with a three-way race. Oh, Bloomberg took more votes from Trump, and Trump therefore, lost to Hillary or lost to Biden or whatever it turns out to be. So that, and then the other way is they just keep attacking Trump, and saying the demographics have changed so that Hillary wins anyway or Biden wins anyway. Because in the general election on the November election night, everything but 5 counties in New Hampshire. I've been saying 10 counties, but it's only 5 counties of the 10 in New Hampshire, not 10 of the 20, but 5 counties of the 10 in New Hampshire that have hand-counted ballots. All the rest of the country is doing these secret, easily rigged computer programs. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to go through some other concepts which we have to do for people that are not familiar with all this stuff, that we're not just making stuff up here in 2016. I've been at this since 1979, and much of this evidence has been out since the 1980s. So all you really need to know as to how our country has been reduced to virtually a slave state is to understand what we've been saying about the elections. But in South Carolina primary, there are no ballots. How unbelievably stupid could we get? This is the same. People have to understand something, though. The motive is from the international banks. They are running the world behind the parties as best they can. They don't always get it right and don't always get what they want. But they're trying to warp the destiny of this nation. And one of their main things is election fraud. If people don't understand, this is war. They are warring against the American people. They knew the American people would begin to react when they started strangling us and squeezing us like they are unnecessarily, economically, and in many other ways, and through these wars and everything. So they had to have a stopgap to stop the reaction. And their media coverage is of the 5 TV networks, coordinated every day, even though they're allowed to disagree on minor things, what they censor and so forth. Their media coverage, and especially then, if their media coverage doesn't work, they got the secretly counted, easily rigged election systems that are installed everywhere. And this, people cannot imagine the level of planning and the detail of this sociopathic mentality behind Goldman Sachs and the Fed and the International Monetary Fund, Bank of Settlements, all these this small international, relatively small international bankers faction and their minions. So that's why they can't believe that this vote fraud is as extensive as it is, the computer election fraud. Because they can't even fathom the sociopathic mentality and all the planning they'll go to get their way. But that's what's happening. The unconscionable arrangement that they have in South Carolina is against South Carolina state laws. And there's a YouTube on our tab at openlettertodonaldtrump.com, No Ballots in South Carolina. And at the bottom of that, there is a YouTube, South Carolina Super Tuesday and Ron Paul, which is a 10-minute YouTube video uploaded in 2008 that shows the exact state law that they are violating. I believe it's Article 2, Section 1, that says there shall be no secret ballot counts. And, of course, they're also against the Declaration of Independence, which says the consent of the governed, the Constitution, which talks in numerous places about shall be elected. That's obviously by honest elections, not rigged elections. And against still 2 standing Supreme Court decisions, which state that our right to vote includes both the right to cast a ballot and the right to know that it was counted honestly. Now, at the bottom of our tab, No Ballots in SC, on the menu at openlettertodonaldtrump.com, go to the bottom. The last thing is Dan Gutenkarf's article, Legal Strategy, absolutely critical, showing many, many more court cases showing how what they're doing all across the country is illegal. So on Saturday, February 20th, 2016, the voters of South Carolina go into a booth, touch a touchscreen computer. They don't even get any kind of receipt, even like you would at McDonald's if you bought a Big Mac. The choices are displayed on the computer screen. The voter touches his or her choice or choices. Then we are supposed to believe that a bleep of energy goes somewhere and is counted properly, which is a leap of blind faith that no American should ever be required to take. In South Carolina, again, there are no paper ballots. That means there's no way to double-check the computer count. There's no way to do a recount. A more absurd, un-American, anti-American, illegal, and unconstitutional system could not be imagined. There is no excuse for it, and it is incredible that no office holder in the USA has objected to this vigorously, and the easily rigged, secret computerized systems in the other 49 states. And what are we taking a blind leap of faith in? It's in the mysterious, hostile to the public and the press, and the local press, mega corporation named ES&S, Election Systems and Software, which the state of South Carolina has chosen and hired to run its ballotless elections. In addition, the election officials in South Carolina sign a contract with ES&S that the election officials are not allowed to inspect in any way the ES&S software that tells the computers what to do on South Carolina primary day. Could every third vote received by Trump be switched to Bush? Yes. Could every fourth vote received by Cruz be switched to Rubio? Yes, or vice versa. And what are the checks and balances to detect this type of election fraud by the vendor ES&S? None whatsoever. The best strategy for Donald Trump and or any other presidential candidate is to object in public to the absurd and illegal no ballots election in South Carolina and beyond, and the secretly counted computer elections beyond, and demand an open, public, transparent count of paper ballots at every neighborhood polling place in the United States. So just focusing on South Carolina to make it simple, Trump could say at a speech, we found out there's no ballots in the South Carolina election. We object to this. We want paper ballots counted in public so we're sure who the winner is. In Donald Trump's case, raising the specter of computer election fraud in public will make it much less likely that the old guard will risk cheating him in South Carolina and or on Super Tuesday. And with so many public opinion polls showing Trump way ahead in so many of these states, there are many more polls being taken now than there were, let's say, in the year 2000. And we assume the Trump campaign is taking its own polls. Thus, this puts a check and balance on the big media, where there's many other polls checking their polls, which was a problem early on in the decades past. Also, with Trump drawing sometimes 1,000 times the crowd that all the other presidential candidates are drawing, if the computers after this show Trump losing in South Carolina on Super Tuesday, half the nation will think he was cheated, even if he wasn't. That's if he raises this issue in public, because millions suspect something is wrong. They just don't know what it is. Under this scenario, the election night gatekeepers would risk being finally exposed and then kicked out of the election system altogether, which is what should have happened a long time ago. For a comprehensive analysis of the election night gatekeepers, see the tab on the menu of Open Letter to DonaldTrump.com that's called Election Night Gatekeepers, and it's linked on our web page called South Carolina Primary No Ballots. In Bernie Sanders' case, while he did announce publicly that his campaign didn't trust the Microsoft Cloud in Iowa and that his supporters were using a special app to monitor the vote in each of the 1,650-plus precincts in Iowa, caucuses in Iowa, to report back to Sanders' headquarters, and this is probably what prevented the Dems in Iowa from declaring Hillary the clear winner, Sanders is failing to challenge publicly the no ballots absurdity taking place in the South Carolina primary. Why do you think the big media is constantly talking about South Carolina and Super Tuesday being a firewall for the Clinton campaign? Well, the answer is because in those states there is no check and balance on the secret ballot counts. The secret easily rigged computer counts. Even in the Super Tuesday states, where most of the states have paper ballots, there is still no check and balance on election day. Nobody, no local press, no candidate, none of the public are allowed to see any ballots on election day. The ballots are whisked out of the sight of the people at closing time, thus forever destroying the chain of custody of the ballots and the chain of evidence in any courtroom sense. Right. And they're taken to secret rooms from which the public is illegally barred by police guard in most cases, or they're allowed to look at a distance where they can't see anything because nobody can see what's happening inside a computer. And it culminates in a secret, easily rigged computer count by one of the handful of mega election vendors. Bernie Sanders is in real trouble if he does not publicly object to these secret computer counts, especially the one in South Carolina with no ballots, and demand what all his supporters and what all American voters deserve, an open, transparent hand count of ballots at the neighborhood polling place before the ballots leave the public sight. Now, to underscore this, here is a quote from the 2004 article by veteran reporter Ronnie Duggar in The Nation magazine on the mega computer companies that controlled the count of the vote in 2004 on election night in the USA, the presidential election between Kerry and Bush. Here's the quote, and we'll give the source again at the end. And on the website under South Carolina No Ballots, it's linked to this whole article. So here's the quote from the article. On November 2, that's 2004, millions of Americans will cast their votes for president in computerized voting systems that can be rigged by corporate or local election insiders. Some 98 million citizens, 5 out of every 6 of the roughly 115 million will go to the polls, will consign their votes into computers that unidentified computer programmers working in the main for 4 private corporations and the officials of 10,500 election jurisdictions could program to invisibly falsify the outcomes. Now, let me comment here. I'll break the comment. I'll tell you when I'm going back to the article. 10,500 election jurisdictions like Cincinnati, Ohio, and Denver, Colorado, and smaller counties have hired basically 4 mega computer companies, all controlled by the same people, I would say, to count the votes. Why don't you know this? Because the 5 TV networks won't tell you. Okay, back to the article by Ronnie Duggar in The Nation in 2004. Quote, the result could be the failure of an American presidential election and its collapse into suspicions, accusations, and a civil fury that will make Florida 2000 seem like a family spat in the kitchen. Well, of course, that never happens because the media is always protecting the election secretly, easily rigged computer counts. Robert Reich, Bill Clinton's labor secretary, has written, quote, automated voting machines will be easily rigged with no paper trails to document abuses. Senator John Kerry told Florida Democrats last March, I don't think we ought to have any vote cast in America that cannot be traced and properly recounted, unquote. They're not the only ones that said things like this, but it really darn few people have, I have to say. Duggar continues, quote, the potential for fraud and error is daunting. About 61 million of the votes in November, more than half the total, will be counted in the computers of one company, the privately held Election Systems and Software, ES&S, of Omaha, Nebraska. Altogether, nearly 100 million votes will be counted in computers provided and programmed by ES&S and 3 other private corporations. British-owned Sequoia Voting Systems of Oakland, California, whose touchscreen voting equipment was rejected as insecure against fraud by New York City in the 1990s. The Republican-identified company Diebold Election Systems of McKinney, Texas, whose machines malfunctioned this year in a California election. And Hart InterCivic of Austin, one of whose principal investors is Tom Hicks, who helped make George W. Bush a millionaire. I'll stop to comment. That is not that significant. The investors, like Romney was even, I think, an investor in one, and so was Chuck Hagel, out of Hagel, Hagel, out of that became the Secretary of State for a while. That they are minor investors. The major investors are those people that are connected in with the international banks that operate behind both parties. Okay, back to the article. Quote, about a third of the votes, 36 million, will be tabulated completely inside the new paperless direct recording DRE voting system on which you vote directly on a touchscreen. Now, let me stop the comment there. So it's not just South Carolina. It's 36 million, or 1/3 of the votes are now with no paper, according to this article. Now, I don't know if that's been changed since then a little bit. I think some of the states have gone away from that and at least had paper, which, again, is useless unless they're counted right as the neighborhood precincts close by the people in the neighborhood precincts in public. So back to Duggar. Unlike receipted transactions at the neighborhood ATM, however, you get no paper record of your vote, since, as a government expert says, quote, the ballot is embedded in the voting equipment, unquote. There is no voter-marked paper ballot to be counted or recounted. Voting on the DRE, you never know, despite what the touchscreen says, whether the computer is counting your vote as you think you are casting it, or by error or fraud it is giving your vote to another candidate. No one can tell what a computer does inside itself by looking at it. An election official, quote, can't watch the bits inside, unquote, says Dr. Peter Newman, the principal scientist at the Computer Science Laboratory of SRE International and a world authority on computer based risks. Continuing on, that was all Duggar's writing. We're continuing on with him. The 4 major election corporations count votes with voting system source codes. These are kept strictly secret by contract with the local jurisdictions and states using the machines. That secrecy makes it next to impossible for a candidate to examine the source code used to tabulate his or her own contest. In computer jargon, a trapdoor, quote unquote, is an opening in the code through which the program can be corrupted. David Stutzman, an Indiana lawyer whose suits in the 1980s exposed the trapdoor that was being used by the nation's largest election company at that time, puts it well, quote, the secrecy of the ballot has turned into the secrecy of the vote count. That is, let me repeat that, the secrecy of the ballot has been turned into the secrecy of the vote count, which of course is illegal by federal Supreme Court decision, Declaration of Independence, Constitution, and many state laws. Now, that's an end of the quote from The Nation magazine. That's quoted from How They Could Steal the Election This Time, subtitled Electronic Counts, Unaudited Touchscreen Ballots, Enhance Opportunities for Fraud, unquote. The article ran in The Nation on July 29, 2004. Ronnie Duggar had earlier written the definitive warning essay about the dangers of computerized vote counting in New Yorker magazine of November 7th, 1988. The entire article, How They Could Steal the Election This Time by Duggar, can and should be read at the Nation magazine website, and it is linked on our tab, South Carolina No Ballots, on our open letter to DonaldTrump.com. 3 comments. Robert Raich and John Kerry had commented on the election fraud issue. Reform Party presidential candidate Pat Buchanan made comments about the dangers of computerized voting and election fraud in response to a question at an Arizona campaign stop on October 28, 2000, shortly before the 2000 presidential election, and we have linked at openlettertodonaldtrump.com, tab South Carolina No Ballots. We have a link to that entire transcript, which is not very long. Number 2, Duggar puts the spotlight on all the factions that could potentially skew a computer-counted election in the Nation article, such as the mega vendors that are hired, ES&S and Hart and so forth, the local election officials, and also ingenious hackers from anywhere in the world. But we at Watch the Vote USA insist on focusing on the mega computer vendors that have been officially hired by the 3,200 plus counties in all 50 states to process 96% of the USA votes on November election nights and primary nights. These companies have the means, the motive, and most importantly, the opportunity to rig any or all of these elections if the rigged result can be made believable to the public. Number 3, do not be mesmerized by the musical chairs played by the financial forces behind the handful of mega vendors. Do not feel that WatchTheVoteUSA.com is discredited if someone can point out that we missed a sale of one of these companies to another. We insist that investigations would show that these mega election vendors are all owned by the same people, namely the people with the money to erect such expensive companies and promote them in order to get control of U.S. elections, and therefore control the destiny of the world in large part, politically anyway. And that would be the ruling elite behind such international banks, as we said, as the Fed, Goldman Sachs, the International Monetary Fund, the Bank of Settlements, based in Switzerland. In other words, whether a county in Michigan or Ohio hires ES&S or Hart Civic, the ruling elite behind the international banks win, as both are arms of this formidable octopus. It's like the laundry detergents Tide and Cheer, whichever you buy, Procter & Gamble benefits. Of course, this is not meant to shed any bad light on Procter & Gamble with regard to elections. So in 2013, a company called Dominion bought 2 of the mega election companies mentioned in Duggar's 2004 article in The Nation. In other words, Diebold and Sequoia were now bought by Dominion. So now there's 3 mega computer election companies counting 96% of the USA vote in the November election nights and primaries instead of 4. And ha. Don't be mesmerized by these almost meaningless details. The solution is to kick out all of these companies, all these computers, all their computers, and all other types of machines, and count the ballot at each of the 200,000 neighborhood polling places in public right at closing time before the ballots leave the sight of the neighborhood judges and neighborhood citizens. So that ends us here. We got the. Please watch the the video that's linked at the bottom of this tab on South Carolina No Ballots on Open Letter to Donald Trump. South Carolina Super Tuesday and Ron Paul. I just watched it myself and didn't realize we had so much important information packed in the 10 minutes erected up in 2008. And then also look at the very important article, Legal Strategy with Dan Gutenkopf, at the very right under the video at the tab South Carolina No Ballots. Dan Gutenkopf has done a ton of legal research, and really most of the court cases, if not all, I've quoted over the years, I got from him. He was at our 2000 Citizens for a Fair Vote Count convention in Cincinnati, Ohio, at the Cincinnati Airport in August of 2000. Okay, thank you for listening. I hope we can make this go viral. People have to understand how important it is. And you can make your voice heard by spreading this on Facebook, through email, through Twitter, by emailing or calling the media companies. Say, why aren't they covering this no ballot primary and objecting to it? And also call the campaigns and put pressure on them to speak up in public, because I imagine Donald Trump and others are getting terrible advice not to bring this up. So the lawyers and all the people that want to remain in good with the Washington establishment that may be advising him, unbeknownst to him, are giving him terrible advice, and maybe a lot of a groundswell from the people would get the candidates to stick up for themselves, their supporters, all American citizens, and challenge this unconscionable anti-American vote system that has us right now being treated like serfs who are not even to look at the counting of our own votes. This is Jim Condit Jr. This has been our February 14th, 2016 update, and it will also be in Stop Trump updates on the website openlettertodonaldtrump.com. You can also sign up as an associate or an ally of ours at watchthevoteusa.com. You can go there and sign up, and you'll get email alerts, which really we don't send out that many, but we have together. You have to help us, or we're not going to be able to get this job done. We need hundreds of thousands of people across the country to help to get our nation's destiny back through restoring honest voting. Thank you very much for listening.